All right, so last week we covered a lot of material. We talked about a succession in Israel of 4 or 5 kings within a decade period, which we talked about those were really 5 kings. Really symbolizes the unrest in Israel, in Samaria. So when you look on the map here, so of course, here in Samaria, you have this quick succession of kings. The only kind of lengthy period was with Menahem, who was king for about 10 years, 8 years, something like that, 8 to 10 years. And so he gave a little stability, but it wasn't very long lasting. It was also a time period for very sinful kings. And we talked about some of that last week. We're going to talk about another guy in the south today who was very sinful. We'll talk about why. But the condition politically is not good. The condition spiritually has not been good for a long time. At the same time, here to the north, in Syria has changed. The kingdom there is now divided, and you have Syria. Oh, don't talk to me. You're going to catch mine again. But you have Syria, and then you have Assyria, and you've got them divided against one another. Very, very much a lot of unrest right now. Now that's going to be soon dealt with, but just as you think about this time period, it's a very unsettled time politically, and has been in a very poor spiritual condition for a while. So as we move forward tonight, we're going to go back to the south in Judah. Right now, at the time period, Pekah is king in Samaria, and in the south, Jotham has become king. His father, Azariah, Uzziah, sorry for a minute, left my right there. Uzziah was king. Remember, he got leprosy, and was shortly after that God lifted the kingdom from him. Jotham is king there. So that's where we're going to go in just a minute. We'll also talk about his son Ahaz. We're going to stay in Judah to look at these 2 kings and their reign. Ahaz, not a good time, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. And then we'll get to Hoshea. Hoshea is, interestingly enough, the last king of Israel. And within that time period, we will see the fall of Israel and then the resettlement of Samaria, Israel, by the Assyrians. And we'll talk about what that looked like. So we get a little bit of some geopolitical things going on along with the spiritual discussion. So let's go to talk about Jotham as we move forward. Did you have a question, Jody?
No, I just like to comment that the evil kings also corrupted the nation at large. So not only did they have a corrupt government, but Israel itself had become so corrupted.
Yes. And that was one of the condemnation that God always gave him. He made Israel to sin, or he made Judah to sin, right? Everything kind of flows down from the higher ups, and the people tend to follow along. It's like the shepherd leading the sheep. Typically, the sheep are always going to go where the shepherd leads them. And if he leads them in a good way, they're going to go the good way. If he leads them into danger, they're going to follow him into danger. And so, let's go on and talk about Jotham. All right, so let's go to 2 Chronicles 27. We'll go to 2 Chronicles. It gives us more detail You can also find this in 2 Kings 15. 2 Kings 15 is not going to give you quite the same amount of information. Again, Chronicles, 1st and 2nd, deal with the kings of Judah solely. And 1st and 2nd Kings give you an overview of the kings of both Judah and Israel. And you'll see them bounce back and forth. And we'll be in 2 Kings in a little bit. But 2 Chronicles 27. Let's look at verse 1. Jotham was 25 years old when he began to reign. Now, we're going to look at that in just a minute. Yes, he became king at 25, but he actually started reigning before that. We'll talk about why. He reigned for 16 years. Not a very long reign. His father reigned for 52 years. So much shorter reign for Jotham. His mother was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now that, again, we've read this before, it sounds good on the face, but notice the kind of way that comment is couched. He says, according to all his father Uzziah had done, except, all right, so he did some good things, but only to the standard of his father, with the exception of what? He did not enter the temple of the Lord. And why make that comment? Why make that comment?
Because his father did.
His father did, right? And it seems to be that Jotham learned from his father's mistake. He did not make the same mistake that Uzziah did. That's why Uzziah was given leprosy by God and lived as a leper for the rest of his life. And then you get the last comment. I don't have it underlined, but it's pretty important. But the people, kind of along with Jody said, still followed corrupt practices. Right, so the spiritual condition is still not very good in Judah. It's not good really at all. Again, we look at our kings. If you look on this particular chart, Jotham is here. His father reigned 52 years and he becomes king. And again, it's a mixed reign. Depends on how you look at it. If you look on the chart up here, you can see in the green, he's just below Uzziah. That's where we are as we come in to this. You also notice that on the other side, we only have one king left, which is Hosea. And we'll talk about him in just a little bit. All right. Verse 21. I'm going to go back to the first chapter just to catch this note. So chapter 16, 21, after Uzziah is given leprosy by God. So just go back one chapter for a second. Verse 21, the text, that last part of the verse, and Jotham, his son, was over the king's household, governing the people of the land. And so for that period of time, that Uzziah had to live separately. Remember, he had his own house. He couldn't be with the family. He couldn't go near the temple. Like he was kind of excommunicated. He was still king for a time period. And Jotham was ruling over Judah at that time. So, yes, he reigned as king 16 years, but his reign is a little bit longer when you consider he was really being king prior to that period of time. Now, there's not a lot else written about him, but we'll catch a few of the things he did. Verses, if you go to 27, I'll just go back where we were, 2 Chronicles 27. Verse 3 says, he built the upper gate of the house of the Lord. So he's doing repairs on the temple and did much building on the wall of Ophel. Now, why were those needed to be built up?
Someone was building ramps against him. I don't remember who, but I think it was Moab.
Who became very arrogant, and the northern king came against him and tore down the walls. Remember Amaziah? What did what did, let's see, who was it? It was Joash. What did Joash say? He said, you're like a thistle talking to a seeker, right? But when he came into the kingdom, remember he brought Amaziah and showed him what he was doing. He raided the temple, he raided the treasury, he tore down, seems like it's 400 feet of wall or whatever it is, a large portion of the wall he tore down. He did all this destruction. Well, that needs to be rebuilt. And so part of Jotham's job was to rebuild that, and that's what he did. He did do some other building. He built in the cities in the hill country of Judah, and forts and towers on the wooded hills. He also fought the king of the Ammonites and prevailed against him. So he's doing some things. The text goes on to say, in verse 6, that he became mighty because he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. And so, some to be commended for him. Now, just for a second, and I'm flipping back to 2 Kings, but I just want to share this with you to kind of get a scope of the political climate. So all this is going on. He's doing some repairs on the building. He's doing some good things, and God is blessing him. Well, what's going on in the rest of the world? 2 Kings 15:37 says, in those days, the days of Jotham, the Lord began to send Rezin the king of Syria and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, against Judah. So, he has some, it says with the Ammonites, Ammon is coming over, and he's had some victories there. But Rezin, now, from where?
Syria.
From Syria, is coming against him. And they're having some success as well as Israel has been at his gates. Pekah is coming, and he's fighting against him too. So not everything's good. Also, I want you to hear what's not said. And again, when he points out Syria, what's the underlying thing? There's division going on up here as well. This isn't all settled up here. Rezin is king in Syria. Who's king in Assyria? Who? Tiglath-Pileser. Right. He is king of Assyria now. In a little bit, we're going to see that gets resolved, and we'll see how. And it's interesting how it gets resolved. Well, we have to get to Ahaz. Sorry. So that just kind of gives you what's going on. So he has a pretty good reign. He does some good things. It wasn't perfect though. So verse 7 through 9 gives us kind of a kind of summary of his of the end. It just says the rest of the acts of Jotham, all his wars and his ways, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. We don't have that. I don't know where that is. But there was more he did, obviously. He was 25 years old when he began to reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And then Jotham slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David. And Ahaz, his son, reigned in his place. So, let's go to Ahaz. So, there's Jotham's reign. Not a lot written about, a little bit. But what about Ahaz? Ahaz reigned from about 741 to 726. So, about 15 years he reigned. About like his father. But he will not be said to be like his father. Verse 1 of chapter 28 says Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. David, his father?
No.
Not his father, but he's...
Great.
Why say it like that?
His ancestor.
His ancestor. And a lot of kings are noted in connection with David. David's like the king who was closest to adhering to God, right? And so he's always he became the standard of all kings to follow
All
after.
right, yeah.
So, again, just real quickly, here, we're getting closer to the end on this side too. Still got a little bit to go. But here's Ahaz, he reigned 16 years. His son, Hezekiah, will eventually become king. But what does he do in that 16 years? Well, not good.
Hey, the bell rings.
Verse 2. All right, we're going to come back to that, so hold on just 1 second. He walked in the ways of the kings of
Israel.
Israel. Why note that?
Jeroboam.
Because it means they all walked away from God.
Yeah, he was in the same line of spiritually speaking. He was just like them. He lived very much like them. He ruled like they did. Would you characterize the kings of Israel as being spiritually minded? Good kings? No, that's not a good statement about your life coming from God to be compared to that group of kings. Said he walked in their ways. Now, he then goes on, the writer, to give us some examples about why he walked in their ways or how he did that. He said he made metal images for the Baals. Now, what is fascinating about that? You know why that's an interesting statement?
Elijah and
I
all
told
the
him not
other things
to.
that happened to drive
God told him not to. What?
Elijah and all the other things that happened with Baal to drive them out, even of Israel, to say that's not right.
Don't do that.
The people even said after Elijah, right, God is God, we'll follow him, and they just turned right around.
Absolutely. And on top of that, you remember this guy right here? Jehu? You remember this guy right here? Joash? What about Jehu? What did he do? After becoming king, what did he do?
Kill all the house they had.
He drove out Baal from Israel, from Samaria. Later on, Baal was driven out from Judah. But now what do we see?
It's coming back.
This old dead thing that was supposed to be gone is now back. Now they've been idolatrous
Oh, that's
pretty much the whole time,
yeah.
right? No king has completely extinguished it.
No.
But here's this thing that you thought you had dealt with and now is back. You know, it's like sin in our life, right? Sometimes we think we've conquered the sin, the temptation in our life. You ever feel like that? You're like, I put that behind me. I don't have to worry about that anymore. And as soon as you start to think like that, what happens?
It sneaks up and bites you.
He wakes up. That old man wakes up. And he comes knocking at the door. Oh, don't forget about me. I'm still here. I'm still outside. I want to get in. Right? And here again, this old way of thinking comes back. And more to that.
Satan never,
It is, what's that?
I said Satan never quits on us.
Never does. He told even Jesus, right, in Matthew chapter 4, the text tells us he went away for a season or for a time. He didn't stay away forever. He went away for a time.
If he ain't bothering you, he's already got you.
Yeah.
That's one of the big dangers we've got to help Jonathan and Sarah watch right now, so too.
Yeah.
But Satan's not happy with the squat they
You know,
made.
the decision they made.
He's
That's
trying to work, he'll be working on different things to bring them up.
Well, Jody leaving and going out of the country, well, that's kind of, you know.
Well, so that's bad enough, right? They've gone back into, they were already in idolatry, but now they're even going back to the Baals. Who introduced the Baals, by the way? Just a quick trivia question. Quiz for you. Who introduced Baal worship in the beginning?
Jezebel.
Who?
Jezebel.
Jezebel, right, Jezebel. Remember that, Jezebel, Baal worship. Jezebel, Baal worship. She's the one who introduced that. Her foreign god she brought when she married who? Ahab. Good. So, that's bad enough, right? That's terrible. But it is the next statement in verse 3 that shows you how quickly things can escalate. He made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom and burned his sons as an offering. His sons as an offering, according to the abominations of the nations. And I like that alliteration there. Whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. Whom the Lord drove out. God, again, dealt with this when Joshua was leading and drove them out. He sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. That is just a horrific statement. They've gone back to sacrificing their children. Now, I wanted to spend just a minute talking about the Valley of Hinnom. I think this is just a good place to remind us of this. So the Valley of Hinnom. You ever, just raise your hand. Anybody ever heard of that term or that place, Valley of Hinnom? You've heard of that?
Yeah.
So, it's mentioned a few times. I've got Leviticus 18:21. I'm going to come back to that. Let's go to Joshua 18:16. I should have switched these around. So, when mapping out the boundaries of the possession of the Promised Land, Joshua 18:16, you notice there one of the boundaries was the mountain that overlooks the valley of the son of Hinnom, which is at the north end of the valley of Rephaim. And then it goes down the valley of Hinnom, south to the shoulder of the Jebusites, and downward to Enrogel. So, I don't know if this map has all of those. I have another map I'm going to show you in just a minute. So, if you're looking in Jerusalem, let me show you this first. All right. Another map for you up here. Just give you a view of where it is. So this is a close-up view of Jerusalem here. The Valley of Hinnom was down here to the south. Now, if you remember if you studied any geography of Jerusalem, Jerusalem was built on a mount. What do we call it today? That's where the Temple Mount is. It's up. And that's why in the scripture, anytime it talks about somebody leaving Jerusalem, they always come down. No matter if they're going south, north, east, west, it's always down. If they're traveling to Jerusalem, it's always up. Why? Because Jerusalem is elevated. Well, there's this valley to the south called the Valley of Hinnom, or the Son of Hinnom. Over time, and we're going to talk about why in just a minute, this became known as kind of like a trash heap. It became known as a disgusting place for various reasons. I won't get into all that history. There's a really good video that World Video Bible School put out about this. But why did it get that reputation? Well, that'll get us into our discussion. So let's go back here. So that's the Valley of Hinnom. That's where it is. It's just outside of the main part of Jerusalem. But let's go to Leviticus 18:21. So Leviticus 18:21, written by Moses from the mouth of God, God warning the children of Israel. And you'll notice in that chapter there's a list of a bunch of regulations that God provides to the children. One of those, and there's no kind of like categorization of it. He just lists a bunch of things they're not to do or to do, right? In verse 21, he says, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch, and so profane the name of God. I am the Lord." So in preparing them to go into the promised land, God says you're not to do child sacrifice. Now, as we read before in 2 Chronicles 28, it's an abomination to God to do that. Now, the worshippers of Moloch are not the only ones to do that. And we may mention some of those other groups today, but they were one of the groups that would offer their children as sacrifices. Now, what we'll see is when we talk about the resettlement of Israel, some of the groups that Syria sends there are also going to do this. But one of the ones maybe we most commonly think about are the worshippers of Moloch. And so God warns them, do not be influenced in this. Now, that's such in my mind, it's so abhorrent to think of anybody doing that to a child. Right? Can you imagine that, doing that with your children? I mean, it's just like, ooh, right? And we do that, right? I'll just say this, I'll move on.
We do it.
It's going on in our country every day.
Sometimes we like to ring their necks.
3 million babies have been sacrificed to the god of selfishness. That is an evil that continues on. And it is so abhorrent. And I believe it is an abhorrent to God. Well, it's an abomination. And it is all about, I don't want to deal with my mistakes.
Yep.
That's evil. Now, and you see it in the vitriol of the defenders of that evil practice. As Christians, we've got to, as in loving ways we can, we have got to fight that mindset. That is okay. So before we get on our high horse and say, well, I would never sacrifice my child to God. It's going on in our country. It's going on in our world today. And it's just as evil. So, I just want to say that. So, why is this important for us to know? Well, I'm going to be as brief as I can about this. So, in a study of hell, right, you think about hell. What is hell? Right?
Eternal.
Hell is what?
It's as internal as heaven is. It's the opposite.
Eternal, everlasting, whatever.
Alienation from God.
It's what? Separation from God. It's a place of punishment, right? It's torment,
A
right?
bad way to look at this is it's your reward if you earn that. I mean, that's a bad way to look at it. That's what it is.
Let me say this way: we've all earned that.
Yep.
But
God's
it's
Christ.
what's going to happen to us if we don't
That's right.
accept and live up to the grace of God,
Yep.
right? And so we think about hell. That's a place of punishment. Well, what's interesting is hell in the Greek language. So there are three terms that are important in this study. And I can't deal with the whole study of Hades, but there in the King James, in Matthew chapter 16, there's a translation there when Jesus says to Peter, and the gates of hell shall not overcome him. Now, in the older translations, that word Hades or Hades is translated hell. It's a bad translation, and I don't understand why, but that's the way they translate it. Now, that word should be more accurately transliterated into Hades, or you could translate it into the problem is we don't really have a term for this other than Hades. Hades has kind of become the term, but it's the waiting place of the souls. And it's of the souls of both good and evil men, right? There's, in that place, Luke 16 tells us, there are two places. There's both paradise and torment. That is not hell, though. That torment is not hell. That's a different place. We've done studies on that. I'll refer you back to any of those studies if you're online on that. I'm not going to try to get a study of Hades tonight. But my point is, that's not a term referring to hell as we think about it. There's another term that only Peter uses. It's only used one time in the Old New Testament, and it's the term Tartarus. And that, I believe, was most popularly translated to the place of torment in Hades. Again, I can't do that tonight, but we can talk about it later. There's a third term, and this term relates to the Valley of Hinnom, or the Son of Hinnom, which is the term in Greek, Gehenna, which is a transliteration of Gehenna. Get real, not a big difference there, but you can understand why it's a transliteration, right? Well, what is Gehenna? Well, Gehenna is a transliteration of a literal phrase, the Valley of Hinnom. What is fascinating about it, and I don't have this here, it's used 12 times in the New Testament. 12 times. 11 times. Do you know who uses it the most often? Jesus. Jesus uses it 11 of the 12 times. It's only used one other time, and I believe it's Peter. I think I have that there. James says it because it's the tongue is set on by the fires of hell. Right? So James uses it one time. Jesus uses it 11 times. And from my understanding, and you can check me on this, it's a word that's not real common for the time. Jesus seems to have picked it out, and particularly going back to the imagery in discussing the place of eternal damnation, going back to the example of the Valley of Hinnom and what it represents to the Jews. Now, to us who, you may just now be being introduced to the Valley of Hinnom. You may have never heard of that term before, or very rarely. But for the Jewish person, especially for the Jewish teacher, the Valley of Hinnom was something they knew a lot. They knew well, and it was something abhorrent to them. And so for him to use the term Gehenna would have been shocking, and I think he meant it to be shocking because of the subject matter he's talking about, and he talks about eternal punishment. And so he, I believe, is trying to describe, and using the term Gehenna, to describe what hell will be like. We talk about the great sin that went on. So why use the Valley of Hinnom? Well, in our text here, it says he sacrificed his children. Well, how does the Valley of Hinnom relate to that? Let me give you a couple other scripture references. Okay, I got 5 minutes. I can at least finish this morning. So, Jeremiah writes about this twice in chapter 7 and 32. Let's go to chapter 7, verse 30. The prophet Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 7, 30 and through 34, "For the sons of Judah have done evil in my sight." You might want to underline that word evil, so you draw attention to it or highlight it. Because I want to know, okay, what is it that they did that was evil? I've done something evil in God's eyes. I want to know what it was so I can hopefully repent of it. Declares the Lord. They have set their detestable things in the house that is called by my name to defile it. And they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind to even do such a thing. I added that last part. I did not even come into my mind. In other words, I think what God is saying is, I couldn't even imagine asking you to do that. Did you notice what he said? You have set their detestable things in the house that is called by my name to defile. They brought the artifacts of Moloch into the temple of God. He goes on. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will no more be called Topheth, or when it will no longer be called Topheth, or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they will burn in Tophet, because there is no room elsewhere. Jesus might have had Jeremiah 7 in mind when he brought this up. Do you think? Was there talking about the fires of hell? And the dead bodies of this people will be food for the birds of the air, for the beasts of the earth, and none will frighten them away. I will silence in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. For the land shall become a waste. I mean, pretty strong language, isn't it? Later on in chapter 32, 35, it says, they built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom to offer up their sons and daughters to Moloch, though I did not command them, nor did it enter my mind, God repeating himself, that they should do this abomination and so cause Judah to sin. I mean, it is such a detestable thing what Ahaz is doing. Think of all of the evil of the kings, and they've done really evil things. You think about Ahab, Jezebel, and what they did, and some of the others. I mean, it was really evil. But the thought that they would send their own children into the fires of the worship of an idol. And so the Valley of Hinnom, why should we know about it? Well, that's the thing we're trying to avoid, isn't it? And it is interesting that Jesus took that to talk to us. Now, the Valley of Hinnom, again, was that constant reminder in Jerusalem, being there just on the south of the city, that they knew what he was talking about, and that image would have been very vivid in their minds. And we'll read this and we'll be done. I think I got 1 minute. Psalm 106:34. They did not destroy the peoples, talking about as they came in the promised land, as the Lord commanded them, but they mixed with the nations and learned to do as they did. Be careful with your influences. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with blood. Remember, God says to Cain, what? The blood of your brother Abel cries out to me from the ground. Thus they became unclean by their acts and played the whore in their deeds. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he abhorred his heritage. He gave them into the hands of the nations, so that those who hated them ruled over them. Kind of sets the stage for what's going to come later. And why does God send them into captivity? Here's one of the reasons why. Next week, we'll finish up this little bit set up here, and we'll move into discussion of Hosea. All right, thank you guys. We dismiss and rejoin for our devotional in just a moment.